We're coming back. If everybody could please take their seats. Our fourth panel today is entitled What Works? Leading Disruption in Industry and Government. Again, I'm Tom Carrico, Senior Fellow and Director of the Missile Defense Project. There's a lot of discussion these days about the traditional and non-traditional models, traditional and non-traditional companies, a rich conversation into using these various tools and partnerships and disruptive approaches to help us better deter and win. Now, in another life, I did a lot of constitutional law, and as one Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers put it, there's a number of practices and traditions and forms of government that are established by accident and force. At the same time, there's a lot of traditions that we have for a reason. And as James Madison put it in Federalist 49, the institutions and such are often of too ticklish a nature, he said, to be unnecessarily multiplied. And so a question for this panel is what traditional things are worth retaining and which should be disrupted, and what should be. With that, I'm delighted to turn things over to my colleague, Emily Harding, who's the Vice President here in the Defense and Security Department and Director of the Intelligence, National Security and Technology Program. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Tom. Wow, I love an afternoon that starts with the Federalist Papers. Just gets me flowing, absolutely. So, disruption is normal. Disruption is natural. I love that we started with discussion about revolution. That's what we're going to talk about partially here today. But the world has changed around the U.S., and the national security establishment has not yet caught up. We say all the right words. We talk about public-private partnerships. We talk about innovation. We talk about agility. But we're still using old processes and old thinking to defeat a new adversary. Why? How should we be thinking about these issues? Throwing aside the buzzwords and talking brass tacks. What will actually push us into a new place? What has worked in the past that could work now? What completely new things should we be doing? And I think this is a really great follow-on from the last panelist discussion as well. So as Tom mentioned, I'm Emily Harding. My amazing panelists today bring a wealth of experience. Each one bridges government and business. They are General Jay Raymond, Senior Managing Director of Cerberus Capital Management and former Chief of Space Operations, the first Chief of Space Operations, which means he ran a startup inside the U.S. military.
I used to use that line, and then somebody said, 80% of startups fail, so I quit using that line.
You clearly succeeded, sir. Also, you were the very first Guardian, which I think qualifies you as an actual real-life superhero. So.
Thanks.
We also have Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan from the U.S. Air Force, the first director of the JAIC and the former director of Project Maven, also a startup inside government. This one also succeeded. Then we have Nini Hamrick, who's the president of Vannevar Labs. She's a former intelligence officer and chief of staff at NCTC. We found out last night at dinner that Nini has a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time in her intelligence career, but I'm going to reframe that as the right place to serve her country in a very hard time. She's the co-founder of Vannevar Labs, which has had a stunning and rapid success, really serving government needs quickly. And then we have Corey Johnston, who's the executive vice president of Strider Technologies and the former chief competition officer at the Department of State, also a former naval aviator. So we've got several of the services represented. F-18 Hornets, yeah?
And E-2 Hawkeyes, and for the record, I was on time.
It's a throwback to this morning for those who were here early. So let's talk about the big picture here. So, General Shanahan, I'm going to start with you. In the recent past, it was anathema for Silicon Valley to want to work on national security issues. Now we're in a moment where some stars have aligned. The current administration is keen to see a new way of doing business within government. Innovation in the tech sector on national security issues is red hot. In the last few years, Silicon Valley has really come around to the idea of working with government. I was at the Hill and Valley Forum just recently, and it has gone from this tiny gathering of like-minded people to this massive 500-person audience, all in agreement that government and industry really need to be linked up and moving forward together. So sort of set the scene for us. How did we get here?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to join my distinguished panelists here. It's hard to talk about how the planets or stars are aligned without first going back to how the planets and stars got out of alignment or misaligned. And that, I'm going to give you an overly simplified TLDR version of this, which honestly I think is the end of the Cold War. And I grant that that's simplified, but let me give just a little bit more what I mean by the end of the Cold War. Immediately upon the wall coming down and we declared sort of victory against the Soviet Union, life changed for the United States. There was a period in which it was no longer this sense of immediate urgency, exigency, we have to go solve problems right now. And then we got into this thing called counterterrorism, counterinsurgencies, which occupied us for then the next couple of decades. But in that time period, you sort of had a very interesting period develop, and that was the defense industrial base kept doing what the traditional defense industrial base does extremely well, always have and will, which is build big capital assets, do the thing that you expect the DIB to do better than anybody else. But at the same time, because we have sort of taken away the sense of urgency about what those big national level threats were, you sort of had this thing begin to happen in Silicon Valley on commercial innovation that took off on a different path than anything else. In a way, I think it's fair to say, although you might come at me on the margins of this, the government wasn't paying attention to that. These companies' business, their profit was not coming from the United States government. Actually, the opposite. A fraction of their money would come from the government. They didn't want to work with the government. They saw something happening in this world of artificial intelligence, maybe called something a little bit differently back then, except for the small group of people that were already the AI acolytes of the world. And they just went at a speed that the government missed, the revolution that was happening in commercial industry. And that divergence happened over time. I call it a drift, not a schism. This was not all of a sudden they're right, we're right, they're wrong. Nothing like that. It was they did the things we wanted them to do. And that's okay. You want them to move at the speed of commercial innovation. But I know, as we're going to talk a little bit more about, what was missing in all of this is the idea you still have to tie innovation to geopolitics and geoeconomics. That was not happening. So I call this a period of unfettered technological libertarianism. It was good in many respects because they were able to go get things done. They were able to innovate at speeds the government could not possibly match. The government was doing the defense industrial-based stuff. But that began to get further and further apart, and that lasted really for about 20 years until the wake-up call over the last few years was China, to be honest with you. Russia became more of a problem with the invasion of Ukraine, but we woke up and said, what's going on here? What should we do to bring these worlds closer together? And I'll finish my piece of this by saying I experienced this very personally and very viscerally when Google, during Project Maven, said, thanks very much, loved working with you, contract has ended, we're going to walk away. Protest inside the company. I've said then, and I continue to say today, I learned a lot from that, we all learned a lot from that. That was a very useful canary in the coal mine. We learned from that all is not right in this world of government, industry, academia partnerships. From that, and I would put Ukraine front and center as people began to change their views of working with the government again. I've talked with so many people in Silicon Valley, said, there was no question Ukraine changed a lot of people's opinion for the better. Are we out of the woods yet? No. But on the other hand, I think Rand and CSET have both done studies, maybe CSIS has done some as well, is the attitudes of people in Silicon Valley, I say as a broad term, not necessarily connected just to the West Coast. It's a little bit more nuanced that it was sometimes portrayed as we're not going to work with the government. We will work with the government on this. We choose not to work with the government on lethal autonomous weapon system. But what Google and Maven did was highlight that in a way that we needed a much more serious conversation. So between the things that have just naturally played out with strategic competition against China, Russia invasion, Ukraine, the idea of a new administration saying you're on board or you're not part of the team, we're seeing that planet stars align again. And we're seeing it, I'd say, loud and clear, including Google with Josh Marcuse, who has done a lot of work over the past few years to bring Google front and center back into government business.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the combination of China and everybody realizing that their IP was getting stolen left and right and realizing just what kind of threat that was. In my time on the Hill, my 6 years on the Hill, it went from please leave us alone and let us operate in China to why aren't you doing something about China and the fact that they're robbing us blind and they're this huge threat. And then Ukraine, I mean, it was amazing to see the citizen sanctions in effect of all of the different companies stepping up to help Ukraine or to pull out of Russia and the effect that that had And I think that definitely highlighted the depth of the relationship between industry and government. So let's talk about that team sport, Corey. I'm going to turn to you. What is the right collaborative relationship between business and government? We talk about collaboration all the time, but what does effective collaboration actually look like?
Now, Emily, I appreciate the question. I appreciate being here. Thanks to CSIS. I want to share some alignment with Seth in the first panel when he said the red lights are blinking.
Yeah.
And for me, they really are. When you think about the team sport and you think about our strategic adversary, I know we have other adversaries with Iran and Russia and DPRK, but there's only really one that could change the way we think, is operating within our systems, be it academia, be it industry, be it influencing standards bodies globally. So what does team sport and team ball look like to counter that? For me, it is making sure that when we have our collective instruments of government, we used to look at this in a strategic or security bucket, and then on the other side, an economic bucket, and we rarely merged the two. All the while, China was looking at this in one strategic lens. How do we push the lever on one side to get concessions elsewhere? And we fell victim to that. It allowed us to have penetration down into, again, academia and industry that accounts for upwards of 250 to 600 billion of IP theft annually just from the United States alone. And in order to figure out what that team ball looks like, we have to reverse the picture and see, how does China look at this? And we talked all day about the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base. And we said, well, our Defense Industrial Base looks like this, and China's looks like this. I would argue that China looks at the U.S. as part of their Defense Industrial Base. And when we look at things, down to the academic institution, whether you're here in the United States, whether you're in Canada, Europe or Japan or Australia, they are using our government grant investments on R&D and hypersonics, our national labs, to really advance their own systems. That we have the ability to look and get that sight picture now and take action against it. So I'll leave it there. I know we're going to talk about the bad word industrial policy later, but I'll leave it there for now.
Good word, industrial policy. No, I think, yeah, absolutely. You told me earlier that you were going to say that about us being part of China's defense industrial base, and I'm glad you told me earlier, because when you said it, I think the groan that I made would have echoed throughout this room. It's so true, and I think it really speaks volumes to how great American innovation is, that it's the number one priority for China to steal. So great. You're welcome. Nini, I'm going to turn to you next. Vannevar has been hugely successful in merging these two worlds, to looking at what the government actually needs, looking at what private sector innovation can really do, and then combining those to really serve a gap. Can you talk a little bit, without revealing any secret sauce, about how you've managed to crack that code and how you see bridging that gap between government speak and industry speak?
Yeah, so at Vannevar, we're building a defense company, and we think that the way to do that is solve a top 3 national security problem and actually build a system. You can't be building a component. You really have to build the system that solves that problem. And when we think about top national security problems, both of you already mentioned this, the rise of the People's Republic of China is indisputably the top problem that we're facing as a country right now. And really the key problem within that is, how do we deter China's territorial ambitions in the South and East China Sea? And when we think about that, I think there are 2 approaches here. There's how do you deter by preparing for that potential contingency, and then there's how do you deter by acting and confronting China in the domains that are contested today. And I think both are really important. So if we think about deter by preparing, this is the cheaper munitions, the autonomous systems that we're seeing both the national security community and next generation defense companies really invest in, and this is how you actually defend territory in the Western Pacific. But I think an equally hard and urgent problem is, how do we deter by acting where China is active today? And I think of the dimensions here, it's harder because it involves whole of government approach. It's not just a military buildup, and it's urgent because they are outcycling us in some of these domains. And so the ones that come to mind that I'm sure we'll dive into as the conversation progresses, the first is economic warfare. Where is China making investments in strategic assets globally that actually impede our ability to operationalize our own potential war plans? and how do we counter that and actually preempt it. The second is really perception operations. How do we change China's perception of their capabilities and our capabilities and how those two would interact and change their behavior? And how do we do that today through what we're demonstrating? And then the third I think of really is counter-narcotics. This is a new area of focus, I think, for the government. Is there's clearly, you can trace a line between the production of precursors in China and their arrival with the cartels in Mexico and eventually, poisoning Americans here. And I think illuminating that and disrupting it is a really important part of deterring by acting today.
And there's a lot of tremendous open source information out there that can be used against that entire mission set, which companies like Vannevar are capitalizing on to draw really impressive insights and then bring them back to the U.S. government.
Absolutely.
Yeah. General Raymond, let's talk about innovation inside government, since you have been there, done that, and succeeded. The risk calculus, though, inside government tends to be backwards. There's rules, there's regulations, we haven't done it that way before. You're talking in the green room actually about jet skis, which are just getting up on skis, which I thought was a really great analogy. And so what should you do in order to shift that risk calculus inside the government, and what can industry do to kind of put the government a little bit more at ease that, yes, this is an acceptable risk, we should move forward together?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks to CSIS. Carrie, thank you for hosting. And I'm going to tell you two quick stories, and then I'll answer your question. And it's young Colonel Raymond at the time was hired as a staff member in an office called the Office of Force Transformation years ago under an Admiral Zabrowski. And I was brought in as the space guy on that team, and I was told to transform space. And my project that I was given was to try to build a satellite in 1 year, customized for a national security need, launch it, and do all that for $10 million to try to change a different business model. It was called TaxSat 1 at the time. What I learned, and forget anything about TaxSat 1, I'm not going to talk specifically about that satellite, but what I learned in that business is if you're transforming something, it means the thing you're transforming isn't doing things well, and they view it as a risk. And so as Jay Raymond was told to transform my old home, it was really difficult because I had to go back to that old home, and they saw me as a little bit of a traitor. And so it would have been a lot easier to transform the tank business or the shipbuilding business because I didn't have to go home to that. But there's just a general cultural view of transformation as a potential risk. Fast forward, I was a one-star in Japan during 2011. And there was a big earthquake, tsunami, and a nuclear reactor disaster. And low-level radiation was being dispersed across Japan. And we were flying airplanes over top of it to measure that radiation dispersal. We had sensors around the Fukushima power plant to measure that. But we had no way of displaying it. We had no common operating picture for radiation dispersal. It was causing challenges. The Air Force, U.S. Air Force, viewed it differently than the U.S. Navy. Tokyo viewed it one way, Washington viewed it another way. It was just causing challenges in our response efforts. And we couldn't figure it out. So no kidding, I said, I'm going to call Google and find out what they would do. So I pick up the phone and I call Google and said, this is Brigadier General Raymond from Tokyo, and here's what I'm trying to do. And they said, hey, there's Google Tokyo right up the road. They'd love to help you. I walked across the street, got in a helicopter, flew up to the helipad where we landed, and the Google office was in a building right next door. I walked up into a small room. Two folks with a laptop were there, and I said, here's what I'm trying to do. And they opened up the laptop, within about 3 minutes, here's how we do it. And man, we couldn't figure that out. I said, well, how do I do that? And they said, do you know Python? I'd never heard of it. I said, what is Python? And they said, it's a computer language. I said, I have no clue. Let me find out. Fly back to Yokota where I was based, put an all call out across air forces in Japan. Does anybody know Python? 2 people did. And there might have been more, but 2 people raised their hands saying they would do it. One was a first lieutenant at Yokota that worked in the comm squadron, I'll never forget this, and one was a brand new airman that had just arrived at Kadena. He'd just joined the Air Force. We sent an airplane down to pick this young airman up, flew him up to Yokota, put him on a helicopter the next day with the first lieutenant. They went down, and in about 2 or 3 days, we were up and running. And I was thinking to myself, if I was trying to do that in the military, I'd still be, for the old people here, filling out the staff summary sheet. I mean, we wouldn't even be able to. And so those 2 things kind of shaped my view of when we were setting up the Space Force, what we needed to do to try to leverage that. And I think there's a few things that have happened that have made it easier. And I see I felt lucky when I was Space Force chief that I had, is a terrible word to use in space, but an explosion of commercial activity going on. And I didn't see that in other domains. You're beginning now to see that in other domains. You're seeing that in the air domain with CCA. You're seeing that in the maritime domain with what's going on there. And I think there's some common themes that have come out. One, I think you're seeing a shift from exquisite to less exquisite. I think if you're going to try to build, just in the business that I'm most familiar with, if you're going to try to build a very exquisite, highly expensive strategic missile warning satellite, you're not going to do that innovatively with an industrial base that's broadened. So we've gone from exquisite to less exquisite. We've gone, and with exquisite, I would also throw in there classified. Highly exquisite, highly classified, which also makes it more difficult for others to work in. I think we've gone from few in numbers to proliferated, which I think operates on a different time cycle, which again is also good for commercial industry. I think we have gone from a hardware-focused traditional to a more balanced hardware and software focus, and I think that has helped with the innovation. And if you look at what we did in the Space Force, we actually, because of that experience of not knowing Python, we actually stood up something called supercoders, where we have indigenous folks inside the Space Force that now are coders that can help solve some of our challenges quickly. And then I would say we have been, and this gets to your comment as well, we have been requirements focused, where we drop a big stack of requirements saying build this, rather than saying, hey, here's what we're trying to solve, and having it be more of a solutions focused effort where industry can say, don't tell me how to build it, tell me what you're trying to solve, and let me innovate to try to get there. And I think those are a few of the things that are happening across all domains that I'm hopeful will now make it a little easier to accept innovation.
Right, that discussion with industry has to be, this is what I need, not, here are the 50,000 requirements that I need you to fulfill.
Right, because they would come back and they'd say, we would never build it that way.
Right.
We're not interested in building it that way.
Right.
So don't tell me how to do it, just tell me what you need, and then accept how we deliver it to you. And that's the big trust factor that you have.
Yeah, I think one of the previous panels was talking about monopsony and the challenges of monopsony, and this is just it. Like, the government can say, you have to fulfill 100% of these things or we're not going to buy it. But that's not really what they need. They actually need about 80% of those things, and the other 20% are nice to have or optional. And if you present it to them as, but that's going to take an extra 3 years and cost you double, right, then that's something maybe you can cut, the flexibility on behalf of the government. So let's talk about that demand signal. And I want to throw this out to the panel. Perhaps you can start us off, Corey. It's about consistency. It's about planning ahead. How can the government send a demand signal that will actually spur growth in business?
Sure. I think you mentioned one of the C's I always think about when I think about government spurring growth. One is consistency. The second word would be commitment. So you need consistency of effort. You need a committed response or committed action. And then I always forget the third C, but you need a resources as well. And so what I think back to
cash, maybe lots of cash.
Yeah, lots of cash. But if I think back to something that we did to spur innovation when I was Chief Competition Officer at Department of State, it was to work with the Commerce Department, work across the interagency, work with the semiconductor industry, with Congress, with allies and partners to really spur the semiconductor reshoring here in the United States. Why did we do that? One, we had lost leadership in that domain. We did not have secure supply lines at all for industry, for DoD, et cetera. And we knew that if we worked together and just set that azimuth or that direction, that industry would follow suit. But we didn't do that without heavy consultation with all of the semiconductor CEOs, be them in Taiwan, Korea, here in the United States, fabless, foundries, tooling companies. And I see some people in the audience that were part of that effort. But that resulted in the CHIPS Act. But here's the challenge. It's the loss of agility that we have. So I'll give you a little history lesson. The CHIPS Act started pen to paper in April of 2020. It took about 2 years to pass. It took another 2 to 3 years for the companies to actually see commitments. Within that span, we saw Japan, who figured out an all-of-society approach to economic security with the passing of their Economic Security Promotion Act in May of 2022. They were able to outspin us. It might not be the most advanced semiconductor technology, but when you're talking defense industrial base, you need the legacy equipment. What's happened since? We've seen hundreds of billions of dollars, but that was an act that started under the first Trump administration, that then was passed into the Biden administration, and now we're seeing signs that the commitment might not be there. So that's what worries me the most, is a lot of companies have made hundreds of billions of dollars here in the United States that when you talk team ball required states to come up, Ohio, Arizona, Utah, to name a few, Texas as well, but also required industry to believe that the U.S. was serious about this. So I'll leave it there.
Number one, put money on contract. There has to be money on contract. That is consistency and stability. I go back to the early days of Project Maven, where there were companies that if they did not get the cash in the last quarter, they're going under, period. You have to move fast. Things are a little bit better now, but we still have to follow up this so-called demand signal with real money. But I'll just give 4 words. 3 of these words are very positive, very encouraging. 1 is a negative word. The positive one's real sense of urgency right now across the government. Crystal clear. Everybody, sense of urgency. Number 2 is agility, saying all the right things is agile, going to move fast, do things a different way. Adaptability. And agility and adaptability, they're not 2 sides of the same coin. They're related, but they really are different. Agility and adaptability. Those are the 3 very positive words. The 4th word right now that is a killer for anybody in this room or online that's in industry is uncertainty. The uncertainty will destroy businesses if we don't give them a commitment to actually spending real money. Not saying, look, we're going through the contracting process, 18 months from now, I think we're going to get something to you. It's not going to work. I got money today, put it on contract, and if you don't take money from the government, you're going to go look for money for somewhere else. Thanks to the venture capital private equity world, there is more money flowing, there's more debt financing, all these other things. But for the government right now, you can send a great demand signal, but if at 24 hours later than one statement, you have a completely different statement, there is a level of uncertainty that is not allowing CEOs to plan their entire business plan. So encouraged in many respects, but we have to give more stability and consistency.
Amen.
So I absolutely agree with that, and I think that urgency and that demand signal to work with American capital and companies around these top problems is really there. I think the point I'd add is that demand signal also needs to come back the other direction to this next generation of defense companies and American capital providers to deeply understand the mission problems that the government's trying to solve in order to deliver on this promise. And I know, for the folks up here, I know Strider does that. I know, Jack, you do that with companies. I know Cerberus is a really important partner to the national security enterprise, but I think there's so much more partnership that needs to happen. And the way that we think about this at Vannevar is how close can we get our engineers and product people, to your point, General Raymond, how close can we get them to the mission problem that they're actually trying to solve and deploy that system? And so just to give an example, I was out in our Honolulu office a couple weeks ago, and I ran into one of our product managers. She graduated from Stanford a couple years ago, no government background, really wanted to work on hard national security problems. And I just asked her what she was up to in Hawaii, and she said, well, I actually just got catapulted off the deck of a carrier that pulled into port in Honolulu today. And she'd spent 2 weeks on the carrier with day and night working on a set of problems. How are they perceived in their environment? A large set of really important problems. And I remember she told me when she got on the carrier, they said, listen, we intend to drop you off in Honolulu, but if a contingency happens, you're coming with us. And that's how you really deeply come to understand these mission problems. It's actually getting forward with them and getting as deep as possible. And I think there really is a demand signal to industry to do that better.
Yeah, pulled it off a carrier. Life goals. That's excellent.
I would add an E to the 3 C's, and it's education. Educated.
Yes.
And you mentioned the education of industry understanding deeply what the challenges are that the department's facing. I would say that there's an education piece. The flip side of that is the government and military leadership, both active active duty and civilian need to understand the private markets better and need to understand what makes them tick. So I agree with everything you said, consistency, stability. A lot of times they don't know. And so I will tell you, I don't know how many times since starting at Cerberus, I'll never forget my first call that I was on, and I just took pages and pages of notes of acronyms. I'm like, what does any of this mean? You know, we don't operate on a profit and loss. How many people have ever heard the term EBITDA? I had never heard of it. And that's like red light, green light stuff in the capital markets. And the average senior leader in the military doesn't understand it. And so they're not trying to screw it up. They just don't understand what they need to do to help you be better help to them. And I think if we can raise the level of awareness of what makes private industry tick to government leaders, it actually will pay huge dividends going forward. Mm-hmm. I'm on a little bit of a kick on this. I'm actually working with the Stanford Business School to put together an education piece. I'm coming up with a name. I don't know what the name is yet, but on business for dummies that I can bring in and just say, hey, why is this important? Why is it important? It's not just important for industry, but it's also important for the folks that want to invest in that industry because they've got to. I'll talk about that later, but there's got to be a little bit more assurances and stability, and I think there are things that the government can do that can be helpful.
If I could just add one quick comment on that. You're absolutely right. When you talk EBITDA and all the things that you think, oh man, I wish I had that as a senior DoD leader, it's not only to translate that over to private industry, it's to translate that to the folks that have some of the instruments of other national power, right. OFAC, right. Treasury, Commerce, they live in that space. And so how do we be smarter about talking internal to the government?
Yeah, so many wonderful public servants have been in public service their entire career, and so they've never thought like a business person has to think. And, it's easy to say, well, they're just in it for the profits. Well, yeah, they're in it for survival, and they've got to be able to make money off of what they're doing, or else they don't get to survive. And that interplay between the private sector and government is what has made America great. We need to keep doing those things. Sue Gordon, who's one of my absolute favorite humans in the entire world, if you're out there, hi Sue, loves to say that one of the things that surprised her most when she joined the business community after a long career of government service was that it occurred to her that both the government and industry think that they are the supported command. And that was a revelation to her. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, that is so true. That government thinks that industry is there to help them, and industry thinks that government is there to, help make them successful and level the playing field so they can go out and succeed. And both are right, but it leads to some awkward conversations. So we really need to just readjust our thinking on some of these things. So now that we've talked about the big picture, let's get a little bit more to those brass tacks and talk tools and facilitators. General Raymond, you mentioned private equity, and this is the world that you're swimming in right now and learning. I really love your Business for Dummies course. I'll come take it myself, I think that'd be great. So how do you see private equity playing in this picture? What do investors need to see to stay in the team game?
Before I retired, the last few years of my service, a lot of friends that had previously retired would come back and talk to me, and they'd say, you do not understand how much money industry is spending trying to figure out what's in your head, and how much time they're spending trying to figure out what's in your head. And I said, I don't, one, that's not worth a whole lot what's in my head, but I'll be happy to tell them. I don't want them to spend a dime. I want them to spend a dime on capability, not on trying to figure it out. I say that because I think what I have learned is, capital markets in the United States is a huge advantage for our country. Estimates are, and don't quote me on this, but I've heard about $40 trillion worth of private capital in our country. Not all of that, as Jack, as you had talked about, will get invested into national security types of business, but some of it sure will, and even some of 40 trillion is a defense budget or two. And so if you understand how to leverage it better, and if you understand better, maybe you can put that to better use to help solve your challenges. There's a few things that I have learned, and some of these are going to be repetitive to what we just talked about. I think predictability and stability is key. And so I don't know how many times, for those that are in private equity business or those that are in companies, in commercial companies, how many times do you read the press every morning to see where the priorities of the department are? Well, that's probably not the best place to find out where the priorities of the department are. We should be having more clear, direct communication between the government and industry on no kidding what our priorities are, and then kind of have some consistency in that message, because if you don't, both the commercial industry and those that are investing in that commercial industry really struggle. I think if you look at what makes industry tick, if you're going to build one satellite and it's going to last 25 years, and building them on those cycles, that's probably not what makes commercial industry work. So I think, as I talked about earlier, proliferation, greater numbers, higher transaction rates, faster procurement cycles are all things that would resonate with private equity companies. Again, clear messages from the government. And then in those messages, there has to be some kind of line of sight to revenue and line of sight maybe to a program or record. Yeah, I don't think you can guarantee it, but there's got to be something clearer than somebody saying something in the press that then all of a sudden people throw dollars at, and then it turns out not to be true, and then you end up getting hurt. I think the other part of this is, going back to my story about people telling me industry spending a lot of money trying to figure out what's in my head. When I said I will tell them, we wrote a document of vision, and we invited industry to come. And unfortunately, when we wrote it, it was classified at the OMG level classification, and nobody could show up. I think there was like 2 or 3 people, and it really wasn't helpful. And so then we kind of took another stab at it, reduced the classification level, but that really has challenges as well. So I think, especially in the business that I was in, although we've worked hard at it and we've made some progress, we really have to continue to help reduce the classification barriers that make it challenging. And then I'll leave it at that.
So you answered part of my follow-up question already, which is what do you think held you back from effectively communicating that vision to industry? Classification for sure,
and
but what other things?
Understanding what's important to industry.
Okay, yeah.
The government doesn't operate on a profit and loss business. We don't. Our goal is spend every dime you have. Don't spend a penny less or spend a penny more. Mm-hmm. Other than that, that's our. You didn't have profit and loss wasn't part of the equation. So understanding that and understanding why that's important to industry, I think is something that the government needs to embrace.
So I want to throw this out to the rest of the panel because I think it's a really important point. Who in government should be communicating to industry what these priorities are and how? What's a safe way to do that gets around the classification issue, does it safely from a security standpoint, and then also is safe-ish, or at least is an acceptable risk when it comes to allegations of things like providing preferential treatment to a particular company? Because I know that was one thing that when I was on the Hill in particular and talking to a bunch of companies, we were always worried about, that we were going to be accused of somehow giving insider information away that would give somebody an advantage over somebody else. So if you were going to give advice to the government folks that are sitting out there and listening, how should they be communicating these priorities?
I'm going to give you a little bit of a contrarian answer. I think free for all. But we have drawn these lines, these walls between anybody associated with the acquisition and contracting world and everything else. Like you shall not, as opposed to you are allowed to. That is a change in risk acceptance. Like there are so many opportunities to go out and have these conversations. The good news is we're seeing signs of this now with, throw the acronyms around, but commercial solutions opening, other transaction authorities, other ways. They're just making it easier to get solicitations from industry. Talks with industry are free for the most part. Have that initial conversation. Now, at some point, when you get the solicitations in, things are going to become a little bit more formal, but that's going to take a while to do it. There should be no reason at all to do, just like Jay said, is you show up at Google Spaces and say, look, I got a problem here. I don't know how to solve this. What do you got? That conversation is not a requirement. It is a problem statement that you're trying to define. So I think that we should actually encourage more conversations. Now, we've seen issues in the past. This is the early days of DIU, where the smallest squadron could say, I got a problem you want to solve. The DIU said, we're going to help you solve it. got them on started, and then Big Air Force said, it wasn't part of our program of record. So there has to be a way we get this right, but I think we should actually encourage more conversation. It'd be interesting, Nina, in knowing how you would talk about this, knowing all the perspectives. But there should be more of it, not this, you shall not. It should be, actually, it's permissible.
So free-for-all. We have a vote for free-for-all. Nini, did you want to jump in?
I mean, yeah, +1 to everything Jack just said about the free-for-all. I'd say we think about it as solving for 3 different groups here. It's the mission end users, the folks that are actually on that carrier that I talked about earlier, the program managers, and that's a really important group that's just, necessarily disconnected from mission in the sense that they usually sit elsewhere. They have a different set of incentives, and then the resource sponsors in the Pentagon who are thinking about the POM.
Exactly.
And it's stitching those 3 groups together, which is so hard. But those are the key. If you have all 3 of them working in synchronicity and speaking the same language, that's when you're actually building something that's going to transition from that, tiny squadron into a future service level POM. And then I'd say, the Defense Innovation Unit, as you said, is so key here. I think Vannevar would not be where we are as a company without DIU, full stop. That's allowed us to transact across every service. It just removes so many of those barriers that, you talked about kind of the dark days of the Project Maven walkouts, which is right around when Vannevar started in 2019. And I think the growth of DIU has been a huge part of the success story of companies like us.
Said so much more eloquently than I did. I retract my free-for-all statement.
I want to pick up, I think you're exactly right. We don't know how to talk to between government and industry, and more importantly, between some of our allies and partners and U.S. government. And so when I think about that, you're spot on. It is thou shalt not, changing that attitude to what can we do? Yeah, I was at a U.S.-Japan tech forum maybe about 6 months ago, and the same questions that I heard from the Japanese 10 years ago, they're asking today. How do we get more intertwined in things like AUKUS Pillar 2? How do we get more entwined in other aspects of the defense industrial base? But I also heard the same answers as I did 10 years ago from parts of the U.S. government that don't know how to have those conversations. And my third C was communicate.
That's
so
better
how
than
do you
cash.
communicate?
I like communicate,
Cash is good too. But how do you communicate in an articulable fashion that says, if you cannot do this today, how do you get there? And I think that's critical. And I think that's one of the things that we're missing, not only to spur industry in the United States, but also more collaboration across our allies and partners.
I agree more. I couldn't agree more. More is better. I will tell you, though, we're not there yet by any stretch of the means. I was the Air Force Space Command commander, took command in 2016, and I wanted to write a letter to industry to say, hey, I'm the new guy here, and we need to work together to move ahead. So we wrote this letter and sent it into the lawyers, and it basically came back saying, dear CEO, love Jay, and everything in between was edited out. You can't say that. If you say that, you're going to go to jail. And so we got to figure out how best to do this, and do it in a way that people feel comfortable doing it. The risk of that, and I would err on the more is better in talking, gets to the point that you start out with on your question. I think we have to be careful, though, after you get done talking and you look at where you want to invest money into. I think there needs to be some kind of strategic thought on that. So we're not sprinkling many millions of dollars to many millions of companies and providing false hope, because that then hurts equity companies that want to go invest in things that takes a company comes and says, hey, we got X number of millions of dollars from the government, then private equity says, okay, we'll double down on that, and then all of a sudden it disappears, and you don't have the consistency, you don't have the line of sight to revenue. So I think we have to be careful there. I think over-communicating is a good thing, but there has to be some kind of strategic thought around it to make sure that we're doing it well.
Okay, so worry less, communicate more, think strategically. Things you shouldn't really have to say, but we're saying them today because it's really important. Okay, I want to turn, Jack, to something that you had talked about earlier, which was more on the incentives. Tax incentives, things like that, the levers that really make a difference, especially for big investments. Can you talk about what levers you have seen be effective in the past and what you would recommend going forward for a government administration that seems to really be interested in using these economic levers. And while you think through your list, I want to remind the audience, please do send in your questions. The QR code is on the screen and online for those who are watching online. You can type in your questions. They will appear in front of me. Thank you.
It'll be kind of a short answer, but I think the world does revolve around incentives. It always has, it always will. So you have to give incentives. And I think we're going to get into, at least I hope you do, a little bit more on what we mean when we say industrial policy, industrial strategy. That is what incentives are all about. And here I would think of incentives in the form of either tax breaks, tax credits, accelerating permitting, which right now in the energy industry is probably one of the things that people are most frustrated with, is how long it will take to build a power plant fueled by either nuclear power or, in this case, data centers. There's a lot that goes on with that. So that's part of it as well. And just the idea of regulatory reform. I'll go back to what I was saying. There are regulations that were built in blood. There's a reason we have regulations today. There's a reason we say thou shalt not. But I think we're at the point now where we say we accept some of that. We are in a different world today. If we agree that we're in a strategic competition facing a peer, not a near peer, a peer adversary, we're going to have to dive into this and do things differently. So for companies, for industries, they have to have incentives. They deal with things that I also didn't know anything about CapEx versus cash flow. How much do I have on the books? How much can I survive? What's my runway? All those things are very important. They have to have the incentives to go do something, and if the government doesn't follow through on the commitment, gone, never to be seen again. So it's a short list, but I think this idea of incentives is so tied, as Jay was getting at this, what are we trying to do as a nation? What's our end state here? Define that, well, you can water flow that down very quickly. But I think it really does start with incentives in the form of tax credits and regulatory reform.
Yeah, I think tax credits is spot on. When we wrote the CHIPS Act, one of the things that four of us literally spent an overnight, all-nighter jamming out was the investment tax credit. It wasn't about the $52 billion that was promised in the act. I mean, that's not sustainable long term. But when you have a 25 or 35% investment tax credit against the CapEx of the tooling to build a foundry here versus somewhere else, you're making up a significant delta in having companies think, okay, the U.S. is serious. I can't invest here. And then point two of that, not only the investment tax credit, what are the states offering? And so they could do a lot to make the further delta up to where that $52 billion is really, spread out sporadically or more strategically or not at all, but you're still going to incentivize industry to onshore, friendshore here.
Yeah, we definitely see that with states in the movie industry. We see that
Yes.
with states in football stadiums. So why not? Why not in the tech
Exactly.
space? Absolutely. So somebody brought up industrial policy. Let's go there. Industrial policy as a concept is back. It is no longer a dirty word. China, of course, has a 20-year head start on us. But what should we be thinking about as the United States of America, as a democracy, as a reasonably transparent capitalism-focused society? When we think about industrial policy, what should that actually mean? Who wants to start?
I'd love to start, because I think about this all the time. This is one of the most important conversations we have to have in this country. What do we even mean by industrial policy? Here's what's not going to happen. Not that many people in this room, maybe a fair portion, have seen the movie The Right Stuff. I've watched it as many times as I did, where there's these scenes in there where the guy comes in screaming, the Soviets are in space. In 10 years, we're not going to wake up on a Monday morning and say, oh my God, China has an industrial policy. We know today China has an industrial policy. The dates may be a little bit massageable in terms of, was it 2012, 2017? Somewhere in there, China said, this is how we're going to compete globally. It's a national security strategy. It's also a techno-economic strategy. That 20-year lost period that I'm talking about, we lost sight of that, and we need to get it back. What do I see as industrial policy? You're trying to take strategic ends, our own national security strategy, our own techno-economic strategies. Do we have them? What do they look like? And then we have technological means. The ways to connect those two is what I call industrial policy. You're trying to strike a balance between hands-off, laissez-faire, let the market do what it does. Works until it doesn't work when you're up against an adversary like China. Between that and overly intrusive, which our government also has a nasty habit of getting into, somewhere in there you're going to find the right balance of this is what we're going to call industrial policy. Chips and Science Act, I thought, was one of the biggest examples. I would also suggest, this could be argued, is that the AI executive orders were a form of industrial policy. I don't think most people would call them that, but I said this was laying out. You know the classic, the cliches, we're not picking winners and losers, we're a market economy. Understand that. But to put down in print $280 billion is worthwhile spending to move into the digital age. Now we'll figure out what companies get what part of the pie by the competitive process in there. But to me, this is that important. We're missing this conversation about, we know our adversary has one, where's ours? A little bit too disconnected right now.
I think there's guardrails that need to come in play. The incentives are important, investment tax credits, other incentives, but the guardrails, if you don't understand what you cannot do, that is an equal part of industrial policy. And when I go back to, what we do at Strider is look for those risk vectors into companies, into universities that are receiving hundreds of millions and more in grant funding to look at hypersonics, sonar, next generation energetics. So when you have that ability, you have responsibilities as well, whether you're a national lab, and what we see over and over again, unfortunately, and it's not just one, it's all, is you have 1,000 talents programs from China. You have one of the other 400 talent programs that are infiltrated, are creating networks, are recruiting people and siphoning that intellectual property out to then be scaled in the PRC in labs that they're developing. We see this over and over again. The thing I'm most excited about is they're starting to take notice at the academic level, in the corporate level, and we're seeing a kind of drive towards private sector intelligence. I know we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, one of the saddest things that I had to do in one of my previous jobs was sit down with wonderful, fabulously intelligent scientists and try to explain to them that there was more than one reason that China wanted to collaborate on that really cool scientific project they were working on, and how we need to be a little bit more careful. And they would look at me with those big side eyes and say, but it's for science. And I would say, I know. And we should do that, but we also have to be careful. Other thoughts on industrial policy?
I agree. I was talking to somebody earlier today, and they were saying that, at its basic function, industrial policy is what we buy and how we buy it. And I think one of the things that I started thinking through after having that conversation, during COVID, we started looking around at the supply chain implications, and the thing that we realized was we didn't understand our supply chain well enough. And I think in anything, kind of domain awareness, if you will, is foundational to anything in the military. I think supply chain awareness and having a basic understanding of the supply chain, the challenges that that we face with that supply chain, is something that we've got to understand even better than we do today. I will tell you, in my Cerberus role, I'm on a supply chain and strategic opportunities fund, which focuses on this. I am much more versed in supply chain challenges than I was back when I was serving. And I think driving a depth of understanding of the supply chain is critical.
And it's shadowed, and it's hard to untangle all of the different layers. I've had several conversations lately with AI companies that are trying to use AI to map supply chains and anticipate potential lapses or nodes that could collapse. And I think that's a really exciting use for that technology in the future.
Now, you cannot stumble into industrial policy. You need a dedicated, concerted effort. Rob Atkinson at ITIF talks about a national competitiveness council. This has to be orchestrated against all the elements of our government and rest of society. It can't be ad hoc, and if you expect it to work, it will not.
Yep. So, Nini, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit about the link between the DIB and deterrence. We can have a strong industrial policy, we can map our supply chain, but if we can't ignite the DIB as a way of proving that capability exists, then there's no teeth behind the deterrent threats. This is something we talked about this morning with Freedom's Forge, that it was the ramping up of the defense industrial base in the years leading up to the U.S. entry into World War II that was so effective in bringing the United States military might to the table. In this case, we're trying to prevent the war that we do not want to join and to demonstrate that we are capable of pushing back any threat, any adversary. So talk a little bit about how you see China looking at us and China looking at our defense industrial base. What's your perspective on this?
I think, when we talk about mobilizing the DIB to present this credible deterrent to the PRC, it goes back to what I said at the beginning about deter by preparing and deter by acting. And deter by acting is really about confronting China in the malign activities that they're doing globally on a daily basis. And so just to go a level deeper on a couple of those categories. So I think first of economic warfare, and this probably expands the definition of the DIB to include American capital. But how do we mobilize American capital toward countering and preempting Chinese investment in strategic, infrastructure and other sectors that are going to be really key if we actually do need to mobilize to respond in the Western Pacific? And Cerberus has been a leader here. I think about the deal several years ago around the Subic Bay in the Philippines. I mean, that's a key point of infrastructure. It's also a compelling investment opportunity, and when those two things come together, that's where you actually see us advancing our national security interests in partnership with American capital providers, and we really want to accelerate that. How can we get more players onto the field, more deals like that one, whether it's key choke points like the Panama Canal or other logistics points in the Western Pacific. The second area is perception operations. I mentioned this earlier. How do we present capabilities that we're developing out of our defense industrial base at a time and place of our choosing that potentially causes strategic confusion for the PRC? And sticking with the Philippines theme, I think about when the Army deployed the mid-range capability in the Philippines last year. So there's a lot of energy in the DIB about developing cheaper munitions. The mid-range capability was the Army's new multi-domain task force saying we can present in the Philippines a capability that can launch both the Standard Missile 6 and a TLAM, and it's in range of mainland China. That is a strategic reset for that theater, and when you get that kind of moment, you also want to capitalize on it with influence and information so that the PRC sees that, and they also, the message is resonating. And I think what was really powerful about the mid-range capability deployment is that we left that capability in theater. It wasn't presented at an exercise and then we pulled it out of theater. We left it in the Philippines. Philippines eventually said, we'd like to acquire our own version of the MRC. And eventually President Marcos actually used it as a strategic bargaining chip with President Xi and said, oh, you want us to, send it's called the Typhoon. You want us to send the Typhoon home? Well, maybe you can stop harassing our fishermen and doing other aggressive and coercive activities in our territorial waters, and then we'll relinquish the MRC back to the U.S. That is what perception operations looks like, and I think it's how we actually present this credible deterrent. And then the last would really be on counter-narcotics, as I mentioned earlier. How do we mobilize the intelligence and law enforcement communities to be able to illuminate the supply chains around fentanyl and the traffic of illicit drugs that transits from the PRC through to oftentimes cartels in Mexico and into the U.S. And those are the three areas I really think of as how do we, get after the problem that you described, the DIB and a powerful deterrent to the PRC.
Now, one of the things that Reagan was famous for was if they were doing something over here, then poke them somewhere else. If you have to demonstrate will, find a place to do it. And it's going to be that combination of having the capability and also demonstrating the will to use it in ways that you can manage the potential for escalation. Okay, so we have some great questions from the audience. And the first one I have to read almost verbatim. You'll see why in a second. General Raymond.
I knew this was coming.
First things first, go Tigers.
There you go.
As a proud Wahoo, I cannot associate myself with those remarks, but fine, go Tigers. How can the rank and file be disruptors for good? It's one thing as 3- and 4-star generals, people like former SecDef Mattis even went so far as to say, protect the Mavericks. But in a world where Mavericks aren't protected, the bureaucracy says no is the default answer. Commanders are often risk averse. How do leaders at lower echelons be part of the solution? This is from Jason Warren on the Joint Staff. And I love this question because part of my leadership training was that leaders can come from anywhere. They can come from the top, they can come from the middle, they can come from the bottom. And trying to encourage people to see a problem and be proactive about solving a problem is really part of what makes the U.S. very strong and what makes the U.S. military especially strong. So I will throw that out to not only you, our Clemson alum, but also the entire panel.
Yeah, Harvard of the South. That's what we call Clemson. First of all, it's great to see young folks that are here. I wish when I was serving, when I first started, that I was a little bolder than I was. I felt like when I was a young lieutenant that I really couldn't make a difference, and I'm telling you, you can. And you've grown up in a way that isn't burdened by old thought. You've grown up in a way that's is a digital native, if you will. I'm a digital dinosaur. So I just think through a couple things when we stood up a Space Force. We had two, a first lieutenant and a second lieutenant came to me and said, "Sir, you have to build this as a digital service." I said, "What does that mean?" And they started talking. I said, "Okay, build the strategy." And so they went off and they built the strategy. They came back and they said, "Sir, you asked us to build the strategy. Here's what you need to do." And I took that and I gave that to somebody that was nationally recognized in the digital expertise business. And I said, "What do you think?" He said, "It's really good. I'd double down on it and do even more." And so when we built the Space Force's digital service, and that's still very much a work in progress, that came from a second lieutenant and a first lieutenant, and they built the strategy that we put resources behind to make it so. If I think through what we have done, part of that was building this supercoder program where we have developed software engineers, and then where we put those folks, and then seeing what they've been able to do to generate change at pretty incredible speeds, harking back to the Google COP model. They've made some really good progress. So I will tell you, leaders need to incentivize that. We need to push that, and you need to feel empowered to be able to make a difference, and you can.
My last assignment in active duty was at the U.S. Embassy in Djibouti. And I say that because I say it's 49% punitive of why I was sent there. Because looking at our young cadets here, I flew for a while, loved it, and then said, I want to learn Chinese. And I was able to learn Chinese and go live in embassies in Beijing, where I really had a front row seat to this transition. I got the dopamine hit to say, this is where the strategic fight is. And so from there, as an active duty officer, I was pulled back to work in industrial policy and then sent to Department of State as a uniformed officer, as chief competition officer there. So part of it is just being bold and then applying your passion to where it is, but you can't continue to kind of grow unless you do well at the basics. And so learn your craft enough to be able to transition and speak with credibility. And I think that maybe, General Raymond, is where you're coming from. But had a great time in Djibouti and China and Taiwan and other places I was posted.
Yeah. Anybody else got a good story about junior folks really making a disruptive difference?
I have two slides that I briefed. Here's how to build an AI project in the DoD and IC. It's just two slides, a lot of words on these two slides. But the banner at the bottom is really what matters. It's culture. It's always about culture. We're trying to put in culture change. The most success we had is a combination of alignment, Kerry Bingen being a part of this alignment from the top Secretary of Defense on down to that most junior person in, at the time, Project Maven, and a little bit less so in the JAG. If they're aligned and you're giving everybody top cover and you say, we're going to allow you to do the things that you need to do, take some risks to do it, you will begin to, people will come out of the woodwork and say, you're serious? Because they're not sure at first, a little suspicious of it. What really has to happen, I never disparage the so-called middle management. That's too easy to do. Middle management is Darwinian. They will do what the bosses say to do and what they're supported from below. If you can get the bosses, the 3-star, 4-star senior executives saying, we are going to do this, they're already doing it at the lower levels. Those of you who are in the government don't think your people are already on ChatGPT one way or the other, they're there. So that's there. And in the middle, the people have to be incentivized by taking care and promoting people willing to do something a little bit different. So to me, it's an easy thing to say culture change, but we're in a process of culture transition. I think there are real opportunities for leaders to press and press and press.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say I feel so much optimism over the last 5 years and the progress we've made in allowing the kind of disruption that you're talking about. I think back to, again, Vannevar, we got started in 2019. This was dark days of early trying to deploy AI into the department, early of trying to connect Silicon Valley and DoD. And I remember we pitched 34 venture capitalists, and we got 32 no's. Like, it was resounding that people thought this was a really stupid idea to start a defense company when there was such a small concentration of primes who had so much control over, creating new defense capability. And that was precisely the reason to do it, is because you had to break that up. Luckily, I mentioned there were two yeses in there. Catherine Boyle, who's really been on the vanguard of defense investing, Greg Sands, an investor who just bets on great teams, and that allowed us to get started. But the change that I think we've seen over the last 5 years is you have investors that are recognizing the capital opportunity here. You have so many young people who are really talented, who want to work on meaningful problems and know that they can do it through this next generation of defense companies. And you have the government sending this demand signal. And so I think there's no better time that a first and second lieutenant can actually make a difference in terms of running a pilot or a proof of concept that actually transitions into something, whether it's an entire service or a new program.
Right. I agree. On the culture piece, I felt we were pretty lucky that we didn't have to change the culture, we just had to build new. Because
Which is harder? That's a great question.
Which is, and I think where we probably aired it initially, we only had a few people in the Space Force initially, and so people would ask me all the time, when are you going to get your culture done? And I like the standard line I would use is, well, this isn't like something you can order on Amazon Prime and it'll come overnight. We were really waiting for the team to get built. We were waiting for folks from the Army to come in, the Navy to come in, from industry to come in. But what I did realize, and we actually reached out to a company, Google, to help us, because there was somebody there that had really thought a lot about culture. And we brought her in, and she gave us a class on how to develop culture, and there's ways you can engineer culture. So rather than just kind of let the wind blow and see where you land, we knew there were some things that we wanted to do. One of those was building a digital service, and moving a service that can go at speed. So what are some of the things we did? We flattened the bureaucracy, took out layers of command. There's things that you can do to get to where you want to go quicker, and I think it's worth thinking through.
I'm going to make a pitch for brave management as well, especially the middle managers that you were talking about. When I was at the agency, I was leading a rather large team of analysts, and there was one in particular that had a real knack for pissing people off. And people would come and complain to me as his boss and say, he was so offensive, and he said this, and he was rude, and he said this, and I said, tell me how he was wrong. And they never had an answer. And, I could coach him on the best way to deliver the message that he was trying to deliver, but tell me how he's wrong. And in a field like intelligence or in a field like innovation, you need people who are going to say things that make people a little bit uncomfortable, because that's how you move forward. And you've got to be a brave leader to be able to back those people up and support them, coach them, but also support them. Analyst in question is now out in the world and breaking things and starting new companies, so he's doing very well. I want to hit one real quick question and then sum it up with a final question looking forward towards optimistic things in the future. But this, I think, is a really good question for this panel in particular. It comes from Sarah Hendrick here at CSIS. Earlier panels talked about the primes potentially becoming extinct. How should primes collaborate with disruptors like Vannevar and leverage their huge capabilities to adapt to new demands of speed and innovation? So this is really about building this ecosystem together and having the primes working with the equity partners, working with the disruptors, and having everybody succeed together as opposed to eat each other alive. So, Corey, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. It is a great question. I think it's part of the perennial challenge right now, is how do you take a behemoth that's been around, that's created a lot of the inefficiencies that we see with field and equipment, and do better. And I think that is a huge challenge. I think about the opportunities in the AUKUS submarine program, for instance. That is, 10, 12, 15 years away from fielding something. If you go to Australia, and when I head to Australia and hit Western Australia and Perth or other cities, this is part and parcel. This is front page news in their mind. But here it's kind of an afterthought sometimes. We don't look at it as a societal effort, but we have to get more agile in the way we do things. I think that's where some of the new disruptors coming in are challenging the defense primes to do better. And I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take them almost coming to the brink of extinction and either falling off that ledge or clawing their way back in.
Yep, needs must, needs must. Anybody else want to jump in?
I would just say, when you look at the primes, you have to look at it through the lens of DoD. The primes are the way they are because of the bureaucracy that they have to interact with. And there's a lot, I always tell people that when we were standing up the Space Force, it would be really easy to stand up that service if we weren't inside the Department of Defense. Inside of the Department of Defense, you have to have enough mass, you have just to cover meetings and just to be part of the process. I think we need to look internal as well. We, meaning like I'm still serving inside the department, but the department also needs to look at how they operate and how they are impacting the organization and the processes of the primes.
And Darwin still works pretty well. I think there's a Darwinian evolutionary cycle here. It's interesting to watch these digital software-centric first companies say, we're going after the primes. They're going to be a new kind of prime. They're not going to call themselves prime, but all intents and purposes, they're going to be prime in their behavior. The question is, are we heading towards a world in which it's hardware, software, integrated companies, both partnering with a lot of smaller startups? At some point, just naturally, some of those companies get bought out, the talent goes into the bigger companies. But I still think we should believe in the ecosystem we have in this country is let those smaller startups have at it, because the bigs are going to do what the bigs do to get big money. That's just what they have to do. Whether it's a defense prime or this new digital prime, what we do really well. The beauty and the beast is it's a very complicated, messy ecosystem in this country. The beauty is it's a really messy, complicated, innovative ecosystem. And out of that, there will be survivors that get to be really powerful companies. How long that takes and what it looks like in the end, different conversation.
Yeah, and I think, so we are in a moment of optimism, but I think this next generation of defense companies, it's still like a basis point in terms of the amount of the defense budget that they're actually accruing. So when we talk about the extinction of the primes, that is, I think that death has been foretold a little bit too aggressively, and they have a really important part of the defense industrial base. I mean, manned fighters are going to continue. There are some platforms that we absolutely need when we talk about preparing for a contingency in and around Taiwan that are going to be built by the previous generation of primes, and they're going to remain an important piece of this. And I think you're absolutely right that when I hear the word prime, I think about a strategic partner to the government that's building systems. And that's ultimately the goal of companies like Vannevar, is just to have more of those, a next generation that does it in a more software-defined way. We can attract a different talent base, but ultimately we are building systems that solve really important national security problems as a strategic partner.
In my mind, it's also a yes and. We need both. If we're going to arm up the way that we need to arm up and modernize the way we need to modernize, we need the expertise of the primes. We need the capacity of the primes. We need the scale of the primes. And then we also need the new thinking. And there's plenty of room for both to survive in this ecosystem and thrive, really. All right, let's end on that optimistic note. I'm going to head down this way on the panel. What do you see in the tech space that really inspires you? For example, I was just down at Soft Week in Tampa, and all the wonderful toys. There were a couple things that I really wanted to pack up in my suitcase and take home with me. But every other booth on the floor was autonomy, drones, counter-autonomy, counter-drone capabilities. You could see a lot of really exciting innovation happening just in that room. I found myself looking around too and wondering, where are all the Ukrainian drone companies? Because I know they're doing some super cool things, and they're not here. They should be here. So what really gives you hope for the future when you look around this space?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I did talk a little bit about penetration in academia and private sector, right? All the IP theft taking place. If 5 years ago, 6 years ago, if you went to a company or a university and said, geopolitics needs to be in your wheelhouse, you would have said, I'll get lost. What we're seeing now, though, especially at Strider, is that those companies and universities have that initial sign, if not well down the path of a wake-up call. And so they're looking at building strategic intelligence capabilities similar and akin to small nation states to say, I need to have my own information to figure out when geopolitics starts to impact my bottom line. And I want to be clear, that does not mean that we have to decouple and keep whole countries out of our innovation base. I think there's goodness. A lot of innovation has been built by a global innovation base, but we have the means now to understand where, when, and how risk comes into our ecosystem. So I'm very optimistic that companies are starting to look to tech, to data, to forecast some of the problems they might have and take action in a geopolitical way that they wouldn't have 5 years ago.
At least we understand the challenge. It's the
At least
right
we understand
step.
the challenge.
Despite the uncertainty, despite the chaos, despite the turbulence, what I love is our messy innovation ecosystem. For every startup company that doesn't make it, there are 5 more ready to jump into the breach. And I get excited when I get on a Zoom call and talk with graduates of Stanford going into Y Combinator and said, what do you got? Wow, I'm just going to encourage you. That's the optimistic piece of me. There's still so much there. People that are willing to say, did some government work, want to come out, and I want to give back, I'm going to do my own company. I just cannot fail to be amazed by people that are willing to do the entrepreneur thing time after time after time. It beat the hell out of me to do Maven and Jake. I'm like, I'm not doing that again. And yet you fail in the startup, like right back at it. It's amazing to me. I think there is reason to be really optimistic about the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, 5 years ago, the reason I got into this is exactly what Jack said, which is I really wanted to see better technology in the hands of the end users I was working with in the Intel community. And I think what you said at the very beginning of the panel, which is Silicon Valley has been developing technologies over the last 20 years that now are meeting this moment. So in the last 5 years that Vannevar has been around, we are primarily an AI company, a defense AI company. I think about the advent of deep learning, transformer-based models, now large language models. Our CTO would say, I have to say, this is the year of agents. This is about agentic AI. I mean, all of those developments are, just powering the capabilities that we're able to deploy. The 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit recently returned from a deployment and talked about using agentic AI capabilities we had developed on board during a long-haul deployment in the Pacific. Like, it is here today. I think there's a sense that there's a lot of buzz around generative AI, but it actually is deployed, and it's getting results for users who are at the far tactical edge with very, very low bandwidth. That's extremely exciting to me and really a point of optimism.
I'm very optimistic as well. People used to ask me all the time, what keeps you awake at night? And I would say, other than sleep apnea, I would say our ability to go fast. Yeah. We'd lost it. And we used to be able to go fast, and we don't today. I think one of the reasons why we had lost it was we didn't need it, that we controlled the shot clock. Cold War had ended, we could kind of pace, and now that's not the case. And I see us responding in now in multiple domains. Still a lot of work to do. That coupled with our incredible commercial industry that I'd bet on anytime. And one thing that we didn't talk a lot about today was our international partners and the incredible capability that those partnerships provide. I'm very, very optimistic that we're gonna make some advances here.
Absolutely. Well, this panel gives me optimism. You have people sitting on the stage who have contributed to their government over long and storied careers and then turned around and taken those talents out into the private sector, done amazingly well, done amazing things, and inspired others to follow in their path. I'm going to send you to a break for 15 minutes to come back at 3:30, but first, please join me in thanking our panel.